My baby is coming. Please buy me," begged the pregnant woman to the rancher at auction. Dust swirls in the street. The sheriff's hammer falls. A crowd laughs cruelly as a desperate woman clutches her belly, begging for mercy. One hardened rancher steps forward, not to own her, but to save her. But what begins as an act of decency soon turns into a battle no one expected. Because hidden in her late husband's papers lies a secret claim, one that gives her unborn child the rights to the only water for miles. The rancher thought he was saving a mother and her baby. Instead, he finds himself standing against a railroad empire ready to crush them both. Guns, law, and greed close in. Now, one woman's courage and one man's faith will decide the future of a town, a ranch, and a newborn child. When justice collides with power, will mercy prevail? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more of the autumn wind-whipped dust across the mining town square, stinging eyes and coating boots in a fine layer of grit. Wooden platforms creaked under the weight of items being auctioned, tools, furniture, and things folks couldn't afford to keep anymore. The crowd pressed close, their breath visible in the cold air as they called out bids and jeered. Hazel Sanchez stood on the rough planks. Her shoulders curved inward as if to shield the child growing within her. Her dark shawl fluttered in the wind and her fingers clutched the worn fabric closer. The weight of stares from the gathered miners, ranchers, and drifters made her cheeks burn with shame. Sheriff Tom Grady's voice carried across the square, sharp with mock cheerfulness. "Next up, gentlemen, a fine Mexican woman, young and healthy, comes with water rights from her late husband's claim." He circled Hazel like a vulture. "Though as you can see, she's in a delicate condition." This drew crude laughter from some in the crowd. Hazel's eyes searched the faces before her, desperate for a hint of kindness. Most looked away or whispered behind rough hands. Then she saw him, Samuel McCord, standing apart from the others. His weathered face was still as stone, but his eyes held something different. Not pity, but perhaps understanding. "Please," Hazel called out, her voice cracking. "Please buy me. My baby is coming." The words cost her dearly, each one carrying the weight of her pride. More laughter rippled through the crowd, harsh as the wind. Some men elbowed each other, making coarse suggestions that brought color to her cheeks. Samuel McCord stepped forward, his boots leaving clear prints in the dust. He was known throughout the region as a solitary man who worked his ranch with quiet determination. Folks said he hadn't been the same since losing his wife and child years ago. Now he stood straight-backed before the platform, his face unreadable. $5, he said, voice steady and clear. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. $5 for the woman and her water rights. Any other takers? His gaze swept the crowd, seeking higher bids. Hazel held her breath, one hand pressed against her middle. Where the baby stirred, the wind caught her dark hair, lifting strands that had escaped her simple bun. She kept her eyes fixed on Samuel, clinging to that thread of hope. Going once, the sheriff called, dragging out the moment. Going twice, he paused again, but the only sound was the whistle of wind through the buildings. Sold to Samuel McCord, relief made Hazel's knees weak. She swayed slightly, steadying herself against a post. The sheriff approached with a length of rope, intending to bind her hands, as was common practice with such sales. The sight of it made her stomach turn. But Samuel shook his head firmly. "That won't be necessary." His voice was quiet but carried authority that made the sheriff hesitate. Instead, Samuel stepped closer to the platform and offered his arm to Hazel. The gesture was simple but spoke volumes. He was treating her as a lady, not property. Hazel took his arm with trembling fingers, grateful for the support as she stepped down from the platform. The crowd parted as Samuel led her away. their whispers following like autumn leaves. Some faces showed disapproval, others curiosity. Few women watching from doorways crossed themselves. Whether in prayer for Hazel or judgment, she couldn't tell. Samuel's wagon waited at the edge of the square, the horses stamping impatiently in the cold. He helped Hazel up onto the wooden seat, making sure she was steady before climbing up himself. The reins felt rough and familiar in his hands as he guided the team away from town. They traveled in silence for a while, the wagon wheels cutting tracks in the dusty road. Hazel sat with her hands folded in her lap, stealing glances at the man beside her. His profile was stern, but there was gentleness in the way he handled the horses, in how he'd helped her into the wagon. The wind eased as they left town behind, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail. Hazel gathered her courage and spoke softly. "Thank you, Sinar McCord. No, $5 is more than I'm worth right now." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "No person should be worth any price," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It ain't right, what they did back there." Hazel nodded, touched by his words. "Still, you didn't have to help me. Most wouldn't." "Most ain't had to bury their own wife and child," Samuel said quietly. The words seemed to surprise him, as if he hadn't meant to speak them aloud. His jaw tightened, and he fell silent again. Understanding bloomed in Hazel's heart. This man knew loss as intimately as she did. Perhaps that's why he'd stepped forward. When others turned away, she watched the countryside roll past, dried grass waving in the wind, scattered pine trees standing guard on distant hills. "I lost my Miguel 6 months ago," she offered. The railroad tunnel collapsed. They never even found his body. The words still hurt to say, but sharing them felt right somehow. Samuel nodded, acknowledging her pain without empty words of comfort. The wagon crested a small rise, and he pointed ahead. "That's my place there. It ain't much, but there's a room for you, and no one'll bother you there." Through the gathering dusk, Hazel could make out a sturdy cabin and barn, a corral, and fields stretching beyond. It wasn't grand, but she could see the care that went into maintaining it. Straight fence lines, well-swept yard, wood stacked neatly against the coming winter. "I can cook," she said quickly. "And so I'll earn my keep, I promise." "We'll sort all that tomorrow," Samuel replied. "For now, you just rest." Been a hard day. The wagon rolled into the yard, and Samuel helped Hazel down with the same careful respect he'd shown in town. She stood for a moment, taking in what would be her new home, at least until the baby came. The wind had died down, leaving behind a stillness that felt like a blessing. In the distance, a coyote called out, and another answered. Hazel wrapped her shawl tighter and followed Samuel toward the cabin, carrying hope like a candle flame in her heart, small and flickering, but alive. Samuel guided Hazel through the jeering crowd, his tall frame acting as a shield between her and the cruel faces. His broad shoulders blocked the worst of their stares, and his steady presence kept the bolder ones from reaching out to touch her. The crowd's taunts followed them like angry wasps. "Reckon McCord's gone soft in the head. Waste of good money on damaged goods." Hazel kept her eyes fixed on the dusty ground, one hand pressed protectively over her swollen middle. Samuel's boots moved steadily beside her smaller steps, marking their path through the chaos. He didn't hurry her or pull at her arm, just maintained that protective barrier between her and the world. The livery stable's familiar smells of hay and horses grew stronger as they approached. Samuel's wagon stood waiting, the 2 bay horses stamping impatiently. The wooden seat was worn smooth from years of use, and the bed was half filled with supplies, flour sacks, seed potatoes, and other necessities from town before helping her up. Samuel paused. His weather-lined face showed no judgment as he waited for her to catch her breath. The moment of quiet gave Hazel courage to speak. "My Miguel, she began softly, her voice trembling. He was working the railroad tunnel when it collapsed 6 months ago. Her fingers twisted in her shawl. They never found his body under all that rock. Just gave me his broken watch and said they were sorry. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. I tried to make do, sold what little we had. Slept in barns when I could, did mending for pennies. Hazel's voice caught, but the baby started showing, and work got harder to find. The debts kept growing. She trailed off, unable to describe how it felt watching her world crumble piece by piece. Samuel nodded once, understanding in his eyes. Without comment, he reached into the wagon bed and pulled out an old wool coat. Here, he said gruffly, holding it out. Evenings turning cold. The coat was faded and patched but clean, smelling faintly of cedar. Hazel wrapped it around herself gratefully as Samuel helped her up onto the wagon seat. The wood creaked as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. They left town slowly, the wagon wheels crunching through fallen leaves. The mountains rose ahead of them, their peaks catching the late afternoon sun in shades of blue and gold. Pine forests cloaked the lower slopes, and somewhere a hawk circled. Riding the autumn winds, after about an hour of travel, Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop beside a clear creek. The water tumbled over rocks, making music in the quiet afternoon. Might want to rest a spell, he said, not looking at her directly. Creek water's clean here. Hazel climbed down carefully, steadying herself against the wagon wheel. Her legs were stiff from sitting, and the baby shifted restlessly within her. The creek bank was rocky but manageable, and she knelt to cup the cold water in her hands. Samuel stayed by the wagon, giving her privacy but keeping watch. He busied himself, checking the horse's harness, his movements efficient and practiced. The silence between them was uneasy, but not unkind. Just the awkwardness of two strangers bound together by circumstance. As Hazel made her way back to the wagon, she noticed Samuel's eyes tracking the difficulty of her movement. He stepped forward to help her up, his support steady but respectful. His hands were rough from work, but gentle in their assistance. They continued on as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the trail. The land changed gradually, becoming more remote. Fewer houses dotted the landscape, and the road grew rougher. Samuel handled the reins with care, avoiding the worst bumps to spare Hazel discomfort. Just as dusk was settling in, they crested a small rise. Below them stretched Samuel's ranch, not large, but well tended. A sturdy cabin sat in a natural hollow, sheltered from the worst winds. A barn and corral stood nearby, and split-rail fences marked out pastures and gardens. Lamplight glowed warmly in the cabin windows. "My niece is staying with me for a spell," Samuel explained, breaking the long silence. "She helps with the cooking," and such. As they drew closer, Hazel could smell wood smoke and something cooking beans, maybe, with cornbread. Her empty stomach reminded her that she hadn't eaten since early morning. The wagon rolled into the yard, and Samuel set the brake. Before helping her down, the cabin door opened, spilling more lamplight into the gathering darkness. A young woman stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron. Her face showed surprise at seeing Hazel, but she quickly masked it with a welcoming smile. "Uncle Samuel." "Supper's just about ready," she called out. The smell of cooking grew stronger, making Hazel's mouth water despite her anxiety. Samuel nodded, then turned to Hazel. "Let's get you settled inside," he said quietly. "Been a long day." The simple kindness in his voice, so different from the mockery she'd faced at the auction, made Hazel's eyes fill with tears. She blinked them back quickly, determined to show strength. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for tonight at least, she had shelter, food, and the company of people who seemed to understand the meaning of mercy. Together, They walked toward the welcoming light of the cabin, leaving the darkness and cold of the auction yard far behind. Samuel's steady presence beside her felt like a promise, not of love or even friendship yet, but of safety and respect. For now, that was more than enough. The cabin's warmth washed over Hazel as she stepped through the door, the heat from the cooking stove chasing away the autumn chill. Copper pots hung from hooks along the walls, and dried herbs dangled from the ceiling beams, filling the air with their gentle fragrance. A well-swept plank floor spoke of careful housekeeping. Samuel cleared his throat. "Annie, this here is Hazel Sanchez. She'll be staying with us for a spell." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Hazel, my niece, Annie." Annie stood by the stove, a wooden spoon in her hand. She was a thin girl of about 15, with Samuel's same serious eyes and straight bearing. Her dark hair was neatly braided, and her apron showed signs of recent mending. She gave Hazel a quick once-over, her gaze lingering on the obvious swell of pregnancy beneath the borrowed coat. "How do you do, ma'am?" Annie said politely, though her tone held a hint of wariness. She stirred the pot on the stove, steam rising in fragrant clouds. Suppers, bean stew, and fresh bread. "Uncle Samuel always comes back hungry from town days." Hazel managed a small smile. "It smells wonderful." She kept her hands folded at her waist, trying not to appear too eager despite her gnawing hunger. "Might I help with anything?" "Already done," Annie replied, though her expression softened slightly at the offer. She began ladling stew into 3 bowls, the earthenware sturdy and well-used. "Best sit down before it gets cold." Samuel pulled out a chair for Hazel at the square table, then took his own seat. Annie brought the bowls over, along with a loaf of brown bread and a crock of butter. The stew steamed invitingly, chunks of potato and carrot visible among the beans. Hazel waited until the others began eating before picking up her spoon. The first bite nearly brought tears to her eyes, not just from the warmth and flavor, but from the simple dignity of sitting at a proper table again. She ate slowly, carefully, though her empty stomach begged for speed. "Water's still hot if you want tea," Annie offered after a while, breaking the quiet. Her voice was gentler now, perhaps noting how Hazel savored each careful spoonful. "Thank you. That would be nice." Hazel looked up to find both McCords watching her, though they quickly turned their attention back to their bowls. She felt the weight of their unspoken questions, their uncertainty about this stranger at their table. When the meal was done, Hazel rose before Annie could gather the dishes. "Please, let me help." She stacked the empty bowls, grateful for something useful to do. "It's the least I can offer." Annie hesitated, then nodded. Together they carried the dishes to the wash basin while Samuel stepped into the parlor. The 2 women worked in companionable silence, Annie washing, Hazel drying with a clean cloth. The familiar routine of domestic work eased some of the awkwardness between them. Heavy footsteps announced Samuel's return. He carried an armload of quilts and a pillow, the fabric well-worn but clean. "Got the guest room ready," he said. "It ain't much, but it's warm enough." "Much obliged," Hazel murmured, carefully setting the last dried bowl in its place. She followed Samuel down a short hallway to a small room at the back of the house. A narrow bed stood against one wall, and a chest of drawers beneath the window held a lamp and a Bible. Samuel set the bedding down and lit the lamp, its gentle glow pushing back the gathering darkness. "Privy's out back," he explained, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Annie's room's next door if you need anything in the night. I'm down the hall." He paused in the doorway. "Rest well, Mrs. Sanchez." Left alone, Hazel sank onto the bed, her hands cradling her swollen belly. The baby kicked gently, as if sensing her relief at finding shelter. She whispered a prayer in Spanish, her mother's language of faith coming naturally in this moment. Of grace. "Dios te guard, mi angelito," she murmured, promising her unborn child safety. God keep you, my little angel. Perhaps we have found refuge at last. The wind moaned around the cabin's corners, rattling the shutters. Hazel could hear Annie moving about in the next room, humming softly as she prepared for bed. From somewhere, in the darkness outside, came the haunting cry of coyotes. In the parlor, Samuel sat in his old leather chair, a lamp burning low beside him. On the wall hung a portrait in a simple wooden frame, a young woman with gentle eyes and Samuel's same stern mouth. His late wife Sarah smiled down at him, her image beginning to fade with time. He studied her familiar features, guilt weighing heavy in his chest. What would Sarah think of him bringing home a stranger, a pregnant widow? The proper thing would have been to let the church ladies handle it. But he couldn't forget the desperation in Hazel's eyes at the auction, the way she had begged for mercy. The floorboards creaked as he rose, his joints stiff from the long day. He walked quietly down the hall, pausing outside Hazel's door. A thin line of lamplight showed beneath it. "Mrs. Sanchez," he called softly. "Everything all right?" The door opened slightly. Hazel stood in her borrowed nightgown, her long, dark hair loose around her shoulders. "Yes, thank you, Mr. McCord. The room is very comfortable." Samuel nodded, unable to meet her eyes directly. "Good night, then?" "Good night," she whispered. "And thank you for everything today." He only nodded. Again, before turning away, the door closed with a gentle click, gentle click. In her bed, Hazel drew the quilts up to her chin, their weight comforting in the unfamiliar room. She could hear the wind and the coyotes, but they seemed less threatening now. One hand rested protectively over her child as sleep began to pull at her. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe. Outside her window, the autumn wind stirred the trees. Stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold in the mountain sky. And somewhere in the darkness, a pack of coyotes called to each other. There, voices rising and falling like lonely prayers in the night. Dawn crept over the Colorado mountains, painting the frost-covered grass in shades of silver and pearl. The early morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and approaching winter. Samuel McCord's boots crunched across the frozen ground as he made his way to the woodpile, his breath forming white clouds in the pale light. The steady rhythm of his axe rang out across the yard. Each swing sent wooden chips flying, the sound echoing off the barn's weathered walls. His muscles worked automatically, mind dwelling on the strange turn his life had taken. Just yesterday morning, he'd ridden into town alone. Now his quiet ranch housed two unexpected guests in the barn. The cattle shifted restlessly in their stalls, waiting for feed. The horses nickered softly as Samuel forked fresh hay into their mangers. The familiar work settled him, though his thoughts kept drifting to the widow sleeping in his guest room. Inside the house, Hazel stirred at the sound of gentle knocking. Her eyes opened to unfamiliar walls, momentary panic gripping her before memory returned. The bed was soft, the quilts warm, such a change from recent weeks of harsh sleeping. "Mrs. Sanchez." Annie's voice came through the door. "I've brought you some breakfast." Estelle sat up carefully, one hand steadying her swollen belly. "Please, come in." Annie entered, carrying a wooden tray, her movements precise and practiced. Steam rose from a bowl of golden cornmeal porridge, and a small pat of butter melted invitingly on top. "Uncle Samuel said to let you rest, but I thought you might be hungry." "That's very kind. Thank you." Hazel accepted the tray, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. "Though I don't mean to lie abed while there's work to be done." Annie's expression softened slightly. "Well, there's always plenty of that around here." She hesitated, then added, "The hens need checking. If you're feeling up to it later, I'd be glad to help." Hazel took a spoonful of porridge, savoring its simple warmth. "This is delicious." A hint of pride crossed Annie's face. "It's better with honey, but we're running low till spring." She twisted her apron in her hands. "I should get back to the kitchen. Just leave the tray when you're done." Half an hour later, Hazel made her way outside, wrapped in her shawl against the morning chill. Samuel looked up from stacking firewood, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, you don't need to be up and about," he said, straightening. "Annie can manage the morning chores." Hazel met his gaze steadily. "Mr. McCord, I may be with child, but I'm not helpless. Please, let me earn my keep." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Henhouse is around back. Watch out for that mean old red rooster." The henhouse proved a peaceful task. Hazel gathered still warm eggs in her apron, speaking softly to the clucking birds. The dreaded rooster merely eyed her suspiciously from his perch. When she emerged with her bounty, she found Annie waiting. 8 eggs. Hazel held them out proudly. "And no battles with your rooster." Annie's face broke into her first real smile. "Old Red must be sweet on you. He usually terrorizes everyone but Uncle Samuel." She accepted the eggs carefully. "These'll make a fine lunch." The moment of warmth was broken by the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Samuel appeared from the barn, his stance alert as a rider, came into view. The man wore a neat black coat and carried a leather satchel, clearly a town official of some kind. "Morning, McCord," the rider called, reining his horse to a stop. "Got some business to discuss." "Mrs. Sanchez here too, I see." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Better come inside then, Mr. Jenkins." He turned to Annie. "Keep an eye on that soup pot. It's a lawyer for, that's what he clearly was." Followed them into the house. He settled his lanky frame at the kitchen table, pulling papers from his satchel while Samuel poured coffee. Hazel sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, anxiety building in her chest. "Now then," Jenkins began, spreading documents before them. "Got some interesting news regarding water rights on your property, McCord. Seems Mrs. Sanchez's late husband filed a legal claim on that river cutting through your south pasture." Samuel's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. "What?" "Filed it proper, just before that tunnel collapse took him." Jenkins tapped one of the papers. "By Colorado territory law, those rights pass to his widow." "That'd be you, ma'am." Hazel stared at him in confusion. I don't understand. Miguel never mentioned any water rights." "Well, they're yours now." Jenkins pushed the papers toward her. "That stream's vital for irrigation and cattle. Valuable piece of property." Samuel set his cup down with careful control, but Hazel could see the tension in his shoulders. That stream was the lifeblood of his ranch, the reason his cattle survived the dry seasons, and now she apparently owned it. "There must be some mistake," she said quickly. "I had no knowledge of this. No mistake, ma'am. Everything's filed proper with the territory office." Jenkins gathered his papers, tucking them back into the satchel. "Just thought you both should know, considering the situation. There's bound to be some conflict once word gets out. Other ranchers won't take kindly to a woman controlling water rights." He stood, settling his hat on his head. "Morning to you both. Mrs. Sanchez, you might want to consider hiring representation. These matters can get complicated." Samuel saw him to the door in silence. When he returned, the kitchen seemed too small for the weight hanging in the air. Hazel remained at the table, her face pale with shock. "Mr. McCord," she began, but he held up a hand. "Not now." His voice was tight. "Need some time to think on this." He strode out, screen door banging behind him. Hazel sat alone at the table, one hand pressed against her child, the other covering her eyes. What was meant to be sanctuary had become something far more complex. The sound of Samuel's axe resumed outside, each blow falling harder than before. Through the window, Hazel watched him work, his movements sharp with suppressed emotion. The morning sun caught the frost still clinging to the grass, making it sparkle like scattered diamonds. So much beauty in this harsh land, she thought. And now she owned a piece of it. A piece Samuel's ranch couldn't survive without. The tension stretched between them like a drawn wire, connecting their fates in ways neither had imagined possible just 24 hours ago. Their bond was no longer simply one of kindness and necessity. Now it was tangled with land and law, water and survival. Annie's soup pot bubbled on the stove, filling the kitchen with warmth and the scent of herbs. But neither Hazel nor Samuel felt much appetite for lunch. They had too much to digest already. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Samuel saddled his horse. His movements were deliberate, each buckle and strap checked with extra care, anything to delay the ride into town. The morning's news about the water rights weighed heavy on his mind. "I'll be back before dark," he told Annie, who stood in the doorway watching him mount up. "Keep an eye on things." Annie nodded, glancing back toward the house where Hazel was already busy with the day's wash. "Yes, Uncle Samuel." The mare's hooves kicked up dust as Samuel rode out, following the familiar trail toward town. Behind him, the sound of women's voices carried on the wind, Annie and Hazel beginning their day's work together, in the yard. Hazel had already filled the washtub with water from the pump. Her arms ached from the effort, but she welcomed honest work after weeks of uncertainty. Annie brought out a basket of dirty clothes, setting it beside the tub. "Here's the mending." "Two," Annie said, pointing to a smaller pile. Mostly Uncle Samuel's work shirts. The man's harder on clothes than any child. Hazel smiled, rolling up her sleeves. My Miguel was the same way, always coming home with torn sleeves or missing buttons. Something in her voice made Annie pause. What was he like? Your husband?" Hazel's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Kind, hardworking. He loved to sing while he worked old songs his mother taught him." She resumed scrubbing a shirt. "We met when I was 16, helping in my father's store. Miguel would come in for supplies, always with a smile and a story." Annie settled onto a nearby stool, drawn in despite herself. "How long were you married?" "3 years." Hazel wrung out the shirt, her movements gentle despite her strength. "We were saving to buy land of our own. Miguel took the railroad job because it paid better than mining." She blinked back tears. "He was so excited about the baby. Said our child would never know want." Annie's face softened. "I lost my parents 3 years ago. Fever took them both in 1 week." "I'm sorry," Hazel said quietly. "It's a hard thing, losing family." They worked in companionable silence after that, Hazel washing while Annie hung clothes on the line. As the morning wore on, Hazel shared more. Stories about her childhood in Santa Fe, her mother's recipes, the celebrations in her village. Annie found herself laughing at tales of Hazel's mischievous brothers and the trouble they caused. Meanwhile, Samuel reached town, tying his horse. Outside the records office, inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight, streaming through grimy windows. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger. "Cord, don't usually see you in town unless it's market day. Need to check some water rights claims," Samuel said, removing his hat. "Filed by Miguel Sanchez concerning the stream on my south property." The clerk's eyebrows rose, but he turned to the appropriate books without comment. Samuel waited, watching as the man's finger traced down columns of neat script. After several minutes, the clerk nodded. "Here it is. Filed 4 months ago, all proper and legal. Claim covers 3 miles of riverbed, including the bend through your grazing land." He looked up at Samuel. "Sanchez died in that tunnel collapse 2 months. Back under territory law, everything passes to his widow." Samuel's jaw tightened. No way to contest it, not if it was filed proper, which it was. The clerk shrugged. "Widow's got full rights now, could sell it, lease it, dam it up if she wanted." Samuel's hands clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. Much obliged for the information. The ride home seemed longer, the setting sun painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Samuel's mind churned with worry. Without access to that stream, his cattle would suffer. Other ranchers would pressure him to challenge Hazel's claim. The situation could turn ugly fast. He arrived home to find the house warm with cooking smells, clothes flapping on the line like pale ghosts in the dusk. Inside, Annie was setting the table while Hazel tended a pot of beans and cornbread. "Supper's almost ready," Annie said, studying his face. "Did you learn anything?" Samuel hung his hat by the door. "Let's eat first, then we'll talk." The meal began quietly, only the clink of spoons breaking the silence. Finally, Samuel cleared his throat. "Claim's legal," he said, looking at Hazel. "Your husband filed it proper 4 months ago. Everything's in your name now." Hazel set down her spoon, face pale. "Mr. McCord, I had no idea. I'll sign it over to you first thing tomorrow." "No." Samuel's voice was firm. "It's your right, not mine. Your husband meant it for you and the baby. I won't take that away." "But your cattle need that water," Hazel protested. "I can't be the cause of harm to your ranch, not after your kindness." Samuel pushed back from the table, memories washing over him like a flood. He remembered sitting helpless by his wife's sickbed, watching her fade despite all his efforts. Some things a man couldn't fight, couldn't fix by force of will alone. "We'll figure something out," he said roughly. "Right now, you need to think about yourself and that baby. That's what matters." He excused himself to the parlor, leaving Hazel and Annie to clear the dishes. The hours crept by, the house growing quiet as the women retired to bed. Samuel remained in his chair by the dying fire, praying silently for guidance in her room. Hazel drifted into uneasy sleep. In her dreams, Miguel came to her, his face kind as she remembered. "Protect our child, mi amor," he whispered. "That's why I filed the claim. For our future." She woke with tears on her cheeks, one hand pressed to her belly where the baby kicked softly. Through the wall, she could hear Samuel's footsteps, still pacing in the darkness. Neither of them would find much rest tonight, both carrying the weight of decisions yet to come. The fire burned down to embers as Samuel knelt beside his chair. "Lord," he whispered, "show me the right path. Help me protect them both without losing everything my father built." Outside, a coyote called lonely. Across the prairie, the autumn wind rattled the shutters, carrying the promise of winter in its bite. But inside, despite the uncertainty hanging over them all, there was warmth and shelter, and the beginnings of understanding. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear as Samuel hitched the horses to the wagon. Hazel emerged from the house wearing her best dress freshly pressed despite its worn edges and a shawl against the morning chill. Annie followed in her Sunday clothes, hair neatly braided. "Ready?" Samuel asked, offering his hand to help Hazel up onto the wagon seat. She nodded, grateful for his steady grip as she settled herself, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Annie climbed up beside her, and Samuel took the reins. The wagon wheels creaked along the dirt road toward town, golden prairie grass swaying in the breeze on either side. Hazel's heart quickened as the church steeple came into view, its white paint bright against the blue sky. She hadn't attended services since Miguel's death, and anxiety fluttered in her chest. Samuel guided the wagon to a stop beside the small wooden church. Already, other wagons and horses crowded the yard, and townspeople milled about in their Sunday best. As Samuel helped Hazel down, she felt the weight of countless eyes upon her. "Did you hear?" A woman whispered none too quietly. "She's the one they sold at auction. McCord bought her." Another voice added, "Never thought he'd take in strangers." Not since his wife passed. Annie pressed closer to Hazel's side, shooting dark looks at the gossipers. Samuel's hand remained steady at Hazel's elbow as they walked toward the church steps. Some folks nodded respectfully to Samuel, while others turned away, lips pressed thin with judgment. Inside, the one-room church glowed with morning light through its simple windows. Wooden pews creaked as people settled themselves, hymn books. Rustling Hazel followed Samuel and Annie to a pew near the back, grateful to sit. Her back had been aching since dawn. The organ wheezed to life, and voices rose in familiar hymns. Hazel sang softly, the Spanish prayers of her childhood mixing with these English words of praise. The music filled the small space, drowning out the whispers and stares. Preacher Thompson stood to deliver his sermon, his weathered face kind as he opened his Bible. "Today we speak of mercy," he began, "and God's provision in times of need." Hazel's eyes filled with tears as the preacher spoke of manna in the desert, of water from rocks, of God's care for widows and orphans. She felt Samuel shift beside her, his own shoulders tense with memory. "The Lord provides," Preacher Thompson continued often through the hands of those who choose mercy over judgment, who remember that every soul is precious in His sight. After the final hymn, people began to mill about, as was their custom. Several women approached Hazel, bearing gifts. "Thought you might need these," Mrs. Baker said, holding out a bundle of soft blankets. "For the little one." "And some preserves," added Mrs. Wilson, setting a basket beside Hazel. "Growing a baby takes strength." Hazel thanked them, touched by their kindness even as she noticed others watching with disapproval. One man muttered something about taking in strays as he passed Samuel. "Time to go," Samuel said quietly, noting Hazel's drawn face. He gathered the gifts while Annie helped Hazel to her feet. They had barely cleared the churchyard when Hazel gasped, clutching her belly. "Something's wrong," she whispered, face going pale. Samuel's heart lurched. "The baby?" Hazel nodded, gripping the wagon seat as another pain seized her. "Too soon," she panted. "It's too soon." "Hold on," Samuel ordered, helping her up. Annie scrambled aboard as Samuel snapped the reins, setting the horses at a fast trot. The wagon jolted over ruts in the road, each bump drawing a muffled cry from Hazel. Samuel's knuckles were white on the reins. His jaw clenched as he urged the horses faster. Annie held Hazel's hand, murmuring comfort as they rushed homeward. "Pray," Hazel gasped between contractions. "Please pray." Annie's young voice rose shakily. "Our Father, who art in heaven." The ranch house finally came into view. And Samuel didn't wait for the wagon to fully stop before jumping down. He lifted Hazel in his arms, her face pressed against his shoulder as another pain racked her. "Annie, get water boiling," he called, carrying Hazel inside. "All the clean pots you can find." "Okay." Annie ran ahead to the kitchen while Samuel carried Hazel to the guest room. He laid her gently on the bed, his hands shaking as he helped her lie back against the pillows. "Need the midwife," Hazel managed, gripping his hand. "Clara Jenkins." "I'll send for her straight away." Samuel turned to leave, but Hazel's grip tightened. "Don't leave," she pleaded, eyes wide with fear. "Please, just a moment more. Moment more." Samuel stood frozen, remembering another bedside, another woman's desperate grip. But this was different. This was life coming, not leaving. Annie appeared in the doorway, arms full of clean linens. "Water's heating," she reported. "Should I ride for Mrs. Jenkins?" Samuel shook his head. "You stay with Hazel. I'll go faster." Hazel released his hand, her lips moving in silent prayer as another contraction began. Samuel hurried out, pausing only to give Annie quick instructions. "Keep her comfortable. If anything changes, send one of the hands for me." The sound of hoofbeats faded as Samuel galloped toward town. Inside, Annie wiped Hazel's forehead with a cool cloth while Hazel gripped the bedsheets. her prayers now spoken aloud in a mix of English and Spanish. Santa Maria, Madre de Dios, Holy Mary, Mother of God. Annie took her hand, adding her own. Prayers to Hazel's, their voices twining together in the quiet room. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting squares of light across the patchwork quilt where Hazel lay, waiting for help to arrive. Through waves of pain, Hazel kept her free hand, pressed to her belly, feeling the life within her struggling to emerge. "Not yet, Pequego," she whispered. "Wait for the midwife. Wait for your time." But the baby, like the life that carried it, would follow its own path, guided by forces beyond their control. All they could do now was pray and trust and hold on to each other as the morning wore on. The autumn sun had long since dipped behind the mountains when Clara Jenkins arrived at the ranch, her medical bag clutched tight. Samuel helped the midwife down from her horse, his face etched with worry in the gathering dark. "Much obliged for coming so quick, Mrs. Jenkins," he said, leading her toward the house. "Wouldn't be anywhere else," Clara replied, unwrapping her woolen scarf. "Been delivering babies in this county longer than you've been alive." Samuel McCord. Inside, Annie met them at the door, her young face pale with concern. "She's hurting bad," she whispered. Clara nodded briskly, already rolling up her sleeves. "Show me to her child." They found Hazel on the bed, her dark hair damp with sweat, hands gripping the sheets as another contraction seized her. Clara set her bag down and went straight to work, checking Hazel's condition with practiced hands. "You've got some hours ahead yet," she announced. "First babies take their time, usually." Hazel nodded weakly, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I'm scared," she admitted. Clara's weathered face softened. "That's natural as breathing, dear. But you're strong, and I've brought plenty of babies into this world." She turned to Annie. "Keep that water boiling and bring me clean linens." Samuel stood in the doorway, hat twisted in his hands, looking lost. Clara shooed him out. "Go on now. This is women's work." He retreated to the porch, where the night air did little to calm his racing thoughts. The sounds of Hazel's labor carried through. The walls sometimes quiet moans, sometimes sharp cries that made him flinch. Each time he remembered Sarah, his wife, and the terrible night she'd died, along with her infant son. Hours crawled by. Samuel paced the wooden planks, wearing a path in the frost that gathered. The moon rose and set. Coyotes called in the distance. Inside, Clara's steady voice guided Hazel through her pains, while Annie scurried back and forth with fresh water and linens. Near midnight, Annie stepped onto the porch. "Uncle Samuel, Mrs. Jenkins says you should come inside and sit. No sense wearing yourself out here." Samuel hesitated, but Annie took his arm firmly. "Come on, Hazel might want to know you're near." She led him to the parlor where the fire had burned low. Samuel sank into his chair, the one that still held the impression of countless nights spent alone. Annie brought him coffee and returned to Hazel's room, leaving the door ajar. Through the night, Samuel listened to the rhythm of Hazel's labor, the rise and fall of pain, Clara's encouragement, Annie's soft prayers. He added his own prayers, rough and unpracticed, but sincere. "Lord," he whispered, "keep them safe, both of them." The hours before dawn stretched endless. Samuel dozed fitfully, jerking awake at each fresh cry from Hazel's room. The sky outside began to lighten, gray seeping into black dots suddenly. Clara's voice rang out. "That's it, girl. Push now, push hard." Hazel's cry changed, became deeper, more primal. Samuel gripped his chair arms, heart pounding. Then a new sound pierced the dawn, a baby's first angry wail. "It's a boy," Clara called out, joy in her tired voice. "A fine, healthy boy." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He stood, uncertain, as Annie appeared in the doorway, beaming through her exhaustion. "Come see," she urged. "Come see the baby." On shaking legs, Samuel followed her. In the bedroom, dawn light filtered through the curtains, casting everything in soft gold. Hazel lay propped against pillows, her face glowing despite her fatigue. In her arms, wrapped in one of Mrs. Baker's gifted blankets, the baby squalled. His displeasure at the world. Samuel Hazel said softly, "Would you like to hold him?" He stepped forward, memories threatening to overwhelm him. Sarah's face, their own son's silence. But this child lived, his cries strong and vital. Owen. Hazel held him out. Samuel took the tiny bundle carefully. The baby settled against his chest, dark eyes blinking up at him. Tears Samuel hadn't expected burned his vision. This child, born under his roof, depending on his protection, something long frozen in his heart began to thaw. "He's perfect," Annie whispered, peering at the baby's tiny fingers. Clara smiled. As she packed her supplies, "Strong lungs on that one. He'll do just fine." She patted Hazel's hand. "You rest now, dear. I'll check back tomorrow." Samuel barely noticed the midwife leaving. Couldn't take his eyes off the infant in his arms, so small, yet so full of life. The boy had Hazel's coloring and something of his father's strong brow. But he was his own. Person already, brand new to the world. "What will you name him?" Annie asked. Hazel's voice was drowsy but content. "Daniel. K. It means God is my judge." She looked at Samuel. "A good name for a boy who will grow up free." Samuel nodded, carefully returning Daniel to his mother's arms. Hazel cradled him close, her eyes already dropping with exhaustion. Within moments, both mother and child were asleep, peaceful in the growing light. Annie quietly gathered the used linens while Samuel built up the fire against the morning chill. The rooster crowed outside, greeting the day. Daniel stirred, making tiny sounds in his sleep. Samuel settled into the chair by the fire, keeping watch. The morning sun broke over the mountains, sending rays of light through the window to paint the room in gold. Everything felt new, as if the world had been remade in the night. "You'll be safe here," he whispered, more promise than prayer. The words fell soft in the quiet room, where Hazel and Daniel slept, where Annie hummed as she worked, where the future felt suddenly full of possibility. Through the window, Samuel watched the sun rise fully over his land. The stream that had caused so much worry yesterday sparkled in the distance. Somehow, in the light of this new day, even that problem seemed less daunting. They would find a way forward, all of them together. The morning light streamed steady and strong, warming the little room where his household slept. Samuel felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, not as a burden this time, but as a blessing. This morning had brought more than just a new life into the world. It had brought hope back to his home. 3 days after Daniel's birth, autumn sunlight streamed through the ranch house windows, casting warm patterns on the wooden floor. Hazel sat in the rocking chair, cradling Daniel as he nursed, oh still. Pale and tired, color had begun returning to her cheeks. She hummed softly, watching her son's tiny fingers curl and uncurl against her shawl. Outside, the steady rhythm of Samuel's hammer echoed across the yard. He'd been working since dawn, too. Patch weak spots in the barn roof before winter storms arrived. The familiar sounds of ranch life drifted through the open window, chickens scratching in the dirt, Annie calling to the milk cow, the creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. "He's getting stronger every day," Annie observed, pausing her, sweeping to peek at Daniel. "Just like his mama." Hazel smiled, touching Daniel's dark curls. "Much obliged for all your help, Annie. Don't know what I'd have done without you these past days." "It's nice having you both here," Annie admitted, her initial wariness having melted into genuine affection. "Uncle Samuel seems different, too, less stern-like." As if to prove her point, Samuel's rich baritone carried across the yard, humming an old hymn as he worked. The sound made Hazel's heart flutter unexpectedly. Later that afternoon, Hazel insisted on helping with supper despite Samuel's protests that she should rest. She stood at the stove, stirring a pot of beans while Annie kneaded bread dough nearby. Daniel slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle Samuel had built, lined with soft quilts, donated by church ladies. The bread needs more flour, Hazel suggested gently. Here, let me show you. She demonstrated the proper technique, her experienced hands guiding Annie's younger ones. The girl soaked up the knowledge eagerly. Samuel watched from the doorway, his expression softening at the domestic scene before him. These past days had transformed his quiet house into something warmer, more alive. The change stirred memories of his late wife, but the pain felt different now, more like healing than hurting. After supper, while Annie washed dishes, Samuel disappeared into his room. He returned carrying something wrapped in faded cloth. Carefully, he unveiled an old fiddle, its wood gleaming with years of care. "Was Sarah's," he explained quietly. "Haven't touched it since she passed." Hazel and Annie went still, recognizing the significance of the moment. Samuel settled into his chair, positioning the instrument under his chin. For a moment, his fingers hovered uncertainly over the strings. Then, slowly, he began to play. The hymn was Amazing Grace, and though the notes were hesitant at first, they soon gained strength. The familiar melody filled the room with sweet, clear tones. Hazel found herself humming along, then softly singing the words she'd known since childhood. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Her voice wavered but grew stronger, blending with the fiddle's song. Annie joined in on the second verse, and for a precious moment, the room glowed with harmony and peace. Daniel stirred in his cradle, but didn't wake, soothed by the music. Samuel's eyes remained closed as he played, lost in memories and melody. When the last note faded, silence fell soft as a prayer. "That was beautiful," Hazel whispered, wiping tears from her cheeks. Before Samuel could respond, hoofbeats approached the house at a gallop. The peaceful moment shattered. Samuel set the fiddle aside and moved to the door, tension returning to his shoulders. A rider appeared in the yard, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Telegram for Mrs. Sanchez," he announced. Holding out an envelope, Samuel took it, pressing a coin into the rider's palm. He brought the telegram to Hazel, who opened it with trembling fingers. As she read, her face drained of color. "What is it?" Annie asked, worried. "The railroad company," Hazel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're demanding I sell them my water rights. They say they need the stream for their new station and tracks." She looked up at Samuel, fear clear in her eyes. "They're offering money," but Samuel's jaw tightened. "But it ain't what you want." "No." Hazel stood straighter, gathering her courage. "That water claim is all I have from my husband all Daniel has. I won't sell his inheritance." "Railroad?" "Men can be mighty persuasive," Samuel warned, though his tone held no judgment. "They're used to getting their way. I don't care." Hazel moved to the cradle, touching Daniel's cheek. "This land, that water tits his future. I won't sign it away." Samuel nodded slowly. "Then we'll stand together, whatever comes." Annie touched Hazel's arm. "We all will." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters Samuel had recently repaired. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark against the sunset. Hazel shivered, drawing her shawl tighter. That night, after Annie went to bed, Hazel sat up with Daniel. Watching him sleep, Samuel remained in his chair by the fire, his presence steady and reassuring. Neither spoke much, but the silence held understanding. The wind moaned around the house corners, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes began their nightly chorus. "I'm sorry," Hazel said, finally, I never meant to bring trouble to your door." Samuel looked up from the fire. "You brought no trouble. The railroad, they're the ones causing it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is your home now, Hazel, yours and Daniel's. We'll face whatever comes together." Hazel blinked back tears at his quiet declaration. Daniel stirred against her chest, making small sounds in his sleep. She soothed him automatically, her heart full of fear and gratitude in equal measure. The shutters rattled again, harder this time. Samuel rose to check the latch, peering out into the gathering dark. Lightning flickered on the horizon, promising a storm. But the threat of wild weather seemed minor compared to the storm of human conflict brewing. They sat up late that night, Samuel eventually dozing in his chair while Hazel nursed Daniel. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made Hazel start up. But each time she looked at her sleeping son, her resolve strengthened. Whatever the railroad might try, she would protect his inheritance. And somehow, knowing Samuel and Annie stood with her made the burden easier to bear. The night deepened, full of windsong and distant thunder. Inside the ranch house, Hazel finally dozed, Daniel secure in her arms, while Samuel kept his silent vigil by the fire. They had found peace here, however briefly. Now they would have to fight to keep it. Dawn brought steel-gray clouds and a chill that cut through wool. Samuel stood at the barn door, watching his breath cloud in the early morning air as he saddled. His horse, the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavy on his shoulders. Hazel appeared in the doorway. Daniel bundled against her chest. "Be careful in town," she said softly. "Those railroad men, they aren't known for kindness." Samuel nodded, checking the cinch one final time. "Ain't my first dealing with their kind. Best to face them straight on, before they think silence means weakness." Annie brought him a packet of biscuits wrapped in cloth. "For the ride, Uncle Samuel." Her young face showed worry beyond her years. Samuel mounted up, settling into the familiar creak of leather. "Keep the doors locked," he instructed. "I'll be back before dark." As he rode out, he glimpsed Hazel through the kitchen window, her head bowed over Daniel, lips moving in silent prayer. The sight strengthened his resolve. The town stirred to life as Samuel arrived. Shopkeepers sweeping porches, wagons rattling down the dusty main street. He tied his horse outside the Western Union office, where he'd learned the railroad men were staying. Inside, coal smoke from a pot-bellied stove mixed with expensive cigar smoke. 3 men in fine Eastern suits looked up from their papers. The oldest gray at the temples, with sharp eyes, smiled without warmth. "Mr. McCord, I presume?" "I'm Gerald Halpern, representing the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company." He gestured to a chair. "Please, join us." Samuel remained standing. "Came. About Mrs. Sanchez's water rights." "Ah, yes, the widow." Halpern's smile thinned. "A unfortunate situation. We've made her a generous offer, which she declined," Samuel cut in. "That should end it." The younger men exchanged glances. Halpern leaned forward. "Mr. McCord, surely. You understand progress cannot be stopped by one woman's sentimentality. That water is vital for our expansion plans. Her rights are legal and clear." "Indeed." Halpern studied him. "Though one might wonder why you're so invested in protecting those rights." "Rights that, coincidentally, cut straight through your ranch." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Meaning?" "Simply that some might question your motives in sheltering a vulnerable widow. Influencing her decisions about valuable property that affects your own interests, that's enough." Samuel's voice carried the edge of steel. Halpern raised his hands. "No offense intended. We're businessmen, not barbarians. But the railroad is coming, Mr. McCord. Progress demands it. It would be unfortunate if Mrs. Sanchez's stubborn refusal led to difficulties for everyone." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Samuel stepped closer, his shadow falling across the desk. "You listen clear. Mrs. Sanchez and her baby are under my protection. Any man who threatens them answers to me." "Is that so?" One of the younger men sneered. "Like you answered that sheriff's auction." Samuel's fists clenched. Halpern shot his colleague a warning look. "We'll be in touch with Mrs. Sanchez directly," Halpern said smoothly. "Good day, Mr. McCord." Samuel strode out, rage burning in his chest. He rode hard toward home, the threatening words echoing in his mind. The weather darkened with his mood, clouds building like artillery. It was nearly dusk when he reached the ranch. Through the window, lamplight glowed warm against gathering shadows. Inside, he found Hazel in her rocking chair by the fire, singing softly to Daniel. The sight eased something in his chest. "Mama's here, me Angelito," she crooned, stroking Daniel's cheek. Looking up, she read Samuel's expression. It went poorly. Samuel shed his coat, dropping heavily into his chair. "They mean to have that water, one way or another." Annie brought him coffee, hovering anxiously. What can they do? Legal tricks? Pressure? Maybe worse. He sipped the hot coffee. "They think I'm influencing you, Hazel, using you for the water." Writes Dios Mayo. Hazel's arms tightened around Daniel. "You've been nothing but kind. They don't care about truth. Only getting what they want." Thunder growled outside as Annie served supper beans, cornbread, and the last of the autumn apples. They ate quietly, the upcoming storm matching their mood, perhaps. Hazel said carefully, "We might find help in town." The preacher, Reverend Thompson He, speaks of justice, of community standing together. Samuel frowned. "Townfolk don't usually stand against railroad money, but they know you, respect you, and they've shown kindness to Daniel and me." Hazel's voice grew stronger. "If enough people speak up, she might be right, Uncle Samuel," Annie added. Reverend Thompson said just last Sunday about standing firm against wickedness. Samuel considered, watching Hazel cradle Daniel. She'd grown stronger since arriving, no longer the trembling woman from the auction. Her quiet dignity demanded respect. Lightning flashed, illuminating the kitchen in stark white. Thunder crashed overhead as rain began hammering the roof. "Very well," Samuel agreed. "We'll talk to the Reverend. But first sign of danger, you and Daniel leave for safer ground." Hazel shook her head. "I won't run." Miguel, her voice caught on her late husband's name. Miguel believed in this land, in building something for our son. I feel him with me, telling me to stand firm. The storm raged outside, but inside, determination settled over them like a warm blanket. Annie cleared the dishes while Samuel banked the fire. Hazel hummed to Daniel, her voice mixing with the rain and thunder. Looking at them, this makeshift family brought together by fate and faith. Samuel knew he'd face whatever came to keep them safe. The railroad's threats echoed in his mind. But watching Hazel's quiet strength as she cradled her son, he found his own resolve matching hers. The night deepened, full of storm song and precious peace. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, they had this moment of unity against the gathering dark. 2 days after the stormy meeting with the railroad men, wagons began appearing on the dusty road to Samuel's ranch. They came slowly. At first told Widow Jensen in her faded buckboard, then the Cooper family's spring wagon, followed by the Hendersons on horseback. By noon, the yard was crowded with concerned neighbors, their voices mixing with the autumn wind. Samuel watched. From the porch, as Hazel welcomed each visitor, Daniel sleeping peacefully in her arms. Some faces showed sympathy, others worry, and a few displayed barely hidden disapproval. "You're putting yourself at risk, dear," Widow Jensen said, patting Hazel's hand. "The railroad always gets its way in the end." Better to take their money and find peace. Peace bought with injustice isn't real peace, Hazel replied softly. But her spine was straight as a fence post. Tom Henderson, who ran cattle on the next property over, cleared his throat. "McCord, you know I respect you, but this fight could hurt everyone." Railroads got long arms and deeper pockets than all of us combined. Before Samuel could respond, the clip-clop of hooves announced another arrival. Reverend Thompson guided his old mare down the lane, his black coat flapping in the wind. The preacher's weathered face was set with purpose as he dismounted. "The Lord calls us to defend the widow and orphan," he announced, striding forward. "Mrs. Sanchez's cause is just, and I aim to stand with her." Samuel nodded gratefully. "Much obliged, Reverend. Was hoping you'd come." More wagons arrived as the afternoon wore on. Samuel opened the barn doors, setting out hay bales for seating. Annie and some neighbor women laid out coffee and cornbread on rough tables. Lanterns cast golden light across. Worried faces as nearly 30 people gathered inside. "Folks," Samuel called out, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Thank you for coming. We're here to discuss this water rights matter plain and proper." The debate sparked quickly. Ranches. Worried about the railroad's influence over cattle prices and shipping? Merchants fretted about losing business if they opposed progress. Others argued that giving in to threats would invite more bullying. The company offered fair money. Marcus Webb, the general store owner, insisted. Why risk everything for principle? Because principles matter, the Reverend countered. If we abandon justice for convenience, what's next? Hazel had been listening quietly, Daniel stirring against her shoulder. Now she stood, her voice clear, though her hands trembled slightly. "This land, this water, it's not about money," she said. The room hushed. "My husband died building that railroad's tunnel. He filed those water rights, hoping to give our child a future." She looked down at Daniel's sleeping face. "This is my son's inheritance. Not just the water, but the right to stand up to bullies who think money matters more than people." The barn fell silent, except for the wind in the rafters. Samuel felt his chest swell with pride at her courage. "The girl's right," Widow Jensen declared suddenly. "My Harold would have said the same. Some things matter more than peace, does not it?" The mood shifted like wind, changing direction. Even Webb looked thoughtful. "The church stands with you," Reverend Thompson announced. "Sunday's sermon will address this directly." Others stepped forward, offering support. Ben Cooper would help. With night watches, the Henderson boys would spread word to other ranchers. Sarah Mills would organize the Women's Aid Society. As the meeting broke up, Samuel felt cautiously hopeful. Hazel's quiet strength had moved hearts more than any argument could. He watched her thank each person. Daniel now awake and gurgling at familiar faces. The sun was setting when the last wagon departed. Annie prepared a simple supper while Samuel checked the stock. The evening settled peaceful around them, stars pricking through the purple sky. Then came the shots. The first crack split the night like lightning. Hazel screamed. Annie dropped a plate. Samuel grabbed his rifle from beside the door. More shots followed, wild but threatening, kicking up dirt near the house. Horses whinnied in terror from the barn. "Get down!" Samuel shouted. Hazel clutched. Daniel turned chest, ducking behind the heavy oak table. Annie pressed against her, both protecting the baby as more bullets thudded into the cabin's logs. Samuel caught glimpses of riders in the darkness, their forms black against the stars. He returned to careful shots, aiming high, a warning that the house could defend itself. Hoofbeats thundered away, followed by mocking laughter. The night fell deadly quiet. "Everyone all right?" Samuel demanded, checking each window. "We're safe," Hazel whispered. Daniel wailed, frightened by the noise. She rocked him, murmuring prayers in Spanish. Annie's face was pale in the lamplight. "They'll come back, won't they?" Samuel's jaw clenched. "Maybe. But we'll be ready." He began checking doors and windows, rifle close at hand. "Hazel, you and Daniel take the back bedroom tonight. Annie, stay with them." "What about you?" Hazel asked. "I'll keep watch." His voice softened at their worried looks. "We've got friends now. Tomorrow we'll spread word of this. Railroad just showed their true colors. Decent folks won't stand for such cowardly threats." But as the women withdrew to the bedroom, Samuel felt fierce cold fingers on his neck. He'd expected legal tricks, pressure, maybe sabotage, but bullets. How far would the railroad go? Through the night he paced, watching shadows, counting ammunition. From the bedroom came Hazel's soft voice, singing lullabies to Daniel, though Samuel suspected she wasn't sleeping either. Annie's lamp burned until dawn. Morning light revealed bullet holes in the porch posts and barn door. Samuel's hand shook slightly as he made coffee, but his voice was steady. "We won't be bullied off this land," he declared. "Not by railroad. Men, not by hired guns, not by anyone." Hazel nodded, dark circles under her eyes, but determination in her face. "God will protect us," she said. Though her arms stayed tight around Daniel, Samuel met her gaze, seeing his own resolve mirrored there. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Samuel saddled his horse. Reverend Thompson waited patiently on his mare, both men grim-faced after the night's violence. Hazel stood on the porch, Daniel bundled against her chest, while Annie checked the rifle by the door one last time. "Bar the doors behind us," Samuel instructed, mounting his horse. "Don't open for anyone you don't know. You will be careful," Hazel promised, her dark eyes showing more worry than her voice betrayed. "God go with you both." The two men rode toward town, dust rising behind their horses' hoofs. The Reverend's black coat flapped in the wind as he spoke of justice and righteousness. But Samuel's thoughts stayed with the bullet holes marking his home. Sheriff Grady's office sat squat and weathered on the main street, its windows reflecting the morning light. Inside, the air hung heavy with tobacco smoke and unease. The sheriff barely looked up from his desk as they entered. "Heard about the shooting," Grady said, shuffling papers. "Terrible business. More than terrible, Reverend," Thompson declared. "It's attempted murder. Those men must be brought to justice." Samuel stepped forward, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. "We're here to file a formal complaint, Tom. Railroad men shot at my house, women and a baby inside." The sheriff's shoulders sagged. He finally met their eyes, his face lined with discomfort. "Can you identify the shooters?" "Too dark," Samuel admitted. "But we all know who sent them. Speculation ain't evidence." Grady's fingers drummed nervously on his desk. "Look, Samuel, you're a good man, but this water rights business, it's bigger than local law. Railroads got friends in the territorial government. My hands are tied. The law is the law," Reverend Thompson insisted. "Whether it's railroad men or common bandits, shooting at innocent folks needs answering." But the sheriff just shook his head. "Best advice I can give. Tell the widow to take their offer before somebody gets hurt worse." Samuel's jaw clenched. He recognized the fear in Grady's eyes, the same fear he'd seen in too many townsfolk lately. The railroad's shadow stretched long across their community. Back at the ranch, Hazel and Annie worked together in cautious harmony. They kept the doors locked, but refused to cower inside. Annie gathered eggs while Hazel watched from the porch, Daniel sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby. The mornings' chores gave their worried hands purpose. Later, as they washed dishes, Hazel began humming softly. The melody caught Annie's attention. "What's that song?" the girl asked, pausing with a tin plate in her hands. "A lullaby my mother sang to me," Hazel replied. She began singing the words quietly in Spanish, her voice sweet and clear. Ani listened intently, then tried to copy the unfamiliar sounds. Hazel smiled, correcting her gently. Together they practiced the song, their voices blending as afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Even Daniel seemed to listen, his tiny fingers reaching toward their music. The sun was setting when Samuel returned, his face dark with disappointment. Hazel knew the news was bad before he spoke a word. They gathered in the kitchen as he reported the sheriff's refusal to help. "He's afraid," Samuel concluded bitterly. "Same as half the town. Talk to folks at Web Store, some say we're holding up progress. Others support us, but nobody's willing to stand against the railroad openly." Hazel sank into a chair, tears spilling down her cheeks. "What hope do we have, then? Just us against their power." She clutched Daniel closer. "Perhaps I should sell, keep him safe." "No." Samuel knelt beside her chair, his weathered hand covering hers. "The Lord sees justice even when men look away. We are not alone in this fight." "Samuel's right," Annie added softly. "God's bigger than the railroad." Reverend Thompson's words from that morning echoed in Samuel's mind. "Let's pray together," he suggested. They gathered around the table, heads bowed in the lamp's gentle light. Samuel's deep voice led them, asking for protection and guidance. Hazel's prayers mixed Spanish and English, while Annie's simple words carried pure faith. Between them, Daniel cooed softly, innocent of the fear surrounding him. The lamplight cast their shadows on the wallman. Woman, girl, and baby, a family formed by hardship and grace. Though danger lurked in the darkness outside, in this moment their unity shone stronger than their fear. "Amen," they whispered together, the word carrying all their hopes for justice, safety, and God's mercy in the days ahead. The autumn days crept by under a blanket of worry. Each morning, Samuel checked the property's perimeter before starting his chores, his rifle always within arm's reach. He reinforced the barn's heavy doors with extra planks and added sturdy locks to the windows. The ranch felt like a fortress. But Samuel knew better than to trust wood alone against determined men. Inside the house, Hazel maintained a steady rhythm of daily life. She kneaded bread each morning, the familiar motion soothing her nerves while Daniel slept nearby in a wooden cradle Samuel had dragged down from the attic. Her hands grew stronger as she worked, matching the determined set of her jaw. When she wasn't cooking or cleaning, she mended clothes with careful stitches, adding patches to worn shirts and darning socks by lamplight. Annie helped where she could, fetching water and gathering eggs. The girl had grown protective of Daniel, singing him the Spanish lullaby Hazel had taught her while she rocked his cradle. Sometimes, when Hazel watched them together, her heart lifted despite their troubles. The evening air turned crisp as Samuel chopped extra firewood, stacking it high against the coming winter. The sound of his axe rang steady across the yard until a cloud of dust on the horizon caught his eye. A sleek buggy approached, its polished finish marking it as a town vehicle rather than a rancher's wagon. "A company's coming," he called to Ward. "The house?" Hazel appeared in the doorway. Daniel held close, while Annie peered through the window. The buggy pulled up to the gate, and a well-dressed man stepped down. His suit was pressed despite the dusty ride, his leather briefcase gleaming with city polish. Samuel recognized him as James Wheeler, one of the railroad's lawyers. "Evening, McCord," Wheeler said, tipping his hat. "Mind if we talk business?" Samuel planted his axe in the chopping block. "Depends on the business. I've brought an offer." "For Mrs. Sanchez." Wheeler patted his briefcase. "A generous one." Samuel led him to the house, where Hazel sat in the parlor with Daniel sleeping in her arms. Annie hovered nearby, watching the lawyer with suspicious eyes. Wheeler pulled papers from his briefcase, laying them on the table with flourish. The railroad company recognizes your legitimate claim to the water rights, Mrs. Sanchez. We're prepared to offer you $5,000 for a full transfer of ownership." The sum hung in the air like smoke. It was more money than most folks saw in a lifetime of ranching. Samuel drew a sharp breath, knowing what such wealth could mean for Hazel and her child. "Consider carefully," Samuel said quietly. "That's no small amount." Hazel looked down at Daniel's peaceful face, then at the papers before her. Without a word, she shifted her son to one arm and picked up the contract. The room held its breath as she tore it cleanly in two. "My son's inheritance is not for sale," she declared, her voice steady and clear. "Not for any price." Wheeler's face darkened like a thundercloud. He snatched up the torn papers, stuffing them roughly into his briefcase. "You'll regret this foolishness. The railroad doesn't take kindly to obstacles in its path." "That sounds mighty close to a threat," Samuel said, stepping forward. "Take it however you like." Wheeler stormed toward the door. "But mark my words, you'll wish you'd taken the money when you had the chance." After the lawyer's buggy disappeared, in a cloud of dust, a heavy silence settled over the house. Daniel stirred and fussed, as if sensing the tension in the air. Hazel soothed him while Samuel stoked the fire against the evening chill. Later that night, after Annie had gone to bed, Samuel and Hazel sat by the hearth. The flames cast flickering shadows as Samuel spoke softly of things long buried in his heart. "My Sarah," he began, his voice rough with memory. "She took fever after our baby was born, lost them both within a week." His hands clenched in his lap. "Thought I'd never feel anything but hollow after that. But seeing you with Daniel," he trailed off, unable to find words for the healing taking root in his soul. Hazel reached across the space between them, her hand gentle on his arm. "When I first came here, I was so afraid. But you've given us more than shelter. You've given us a home." Her eyes shone in the firelight. God's mercy works in unexpected ways. Unknown to them, Annie sat on the stairs in her nightgown, listening. A smile spread across her face as she watched her uncle and Hazel draw closer in the firelight, their shadows merging on the wall behind them. It's not quite love, perhaps, but something warm and promising, like spring earth waiting for seed. Daniel's soft cooing drew their attention, and both Samuel and Hazel laughed as the baby reached for them with tiny, grasping fingers. In that moment, despite the threats hanging over them, they were simply a family sharing the warmth of hearth and hope. The town hall buzzed with angry voices as Samuel and Hazel entered. Daniel bundled against her chest. Every bench was filled with townsfolk, ranchers, and railroadmen in dark suits. Lamplight cast long shadows across worried faces. Mr. Halpern, the railroad's chief agent, stood at the front, his voice sharp as a knife. "This woman has no legal standing. The rights belong to her dead husband's estate, not to her." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Samuel's jaw tightened as he stood protective beside Hazel. The preacher, Reverend Mills, watched from his seat. Near the front, his Bible open on his lap. Hazel stepped forward, her hand steady as she pulled a folded paper from her shawl. "My husband's marriage certificate," she announced clearly. "And with it, the water rights document that extends to all heirs of my household. That includes my son, Daniel." "Ow." The Reverend rose, his voice carrying across the hall. "It would be a grave sin to steal from a newborn child. The Lord commands us to protect widows and orphans, not rob them." The crowd erupted in debate. Farmers nodded in agreement while railroad men shuffled their papers frantically. More voices joined in support of Hazel and Daniel, red-faced and defeated. Halpern gathered his papers. "We'll seek our opportunities elsewhere," he spat, leading his men toward the door. Tears of joy streamed down Hazel's cheeks as she held Daniel close. Neighbors gathered around them, offering congratulations and support. Samuel lifted his eyes heavenward. "Thank you, Lord. he whispered as Annie jumped with joy beside him. 3 days after the town hall meeting, peace settled over the McCord Ranch like a warm blanket. The kitchen glowed with lamplight as Samuel, Hazel, Annie, and baby Daniel gathered. For supper, the aroma of fresh bread and stew filled the air while crickets chirped softly outside. Hazel rocked Daniel in her arms, humming a gentle lullaby. His tiny fingers curled around the edge of his blanket as his eyes grew heavy. Samuel watched them from his place at the head of the table, his stern features softened by the lamplight. "Let us pray," Samuel said, bowing his head. "Lord, we thank you for your deliverance, for justice served, and for bringing us together as family. Amen." After they finished their meal, Samuel cleared his throat. "Hazel," he began, his voice rough. "With emotion, I want you to stay here, not because of any debt or obligation, but because you and Daniel belong here, as family. Oh yes, please stay." Annie exclaimed, her eyes bright with hope. Tears welled in Hazel's eyes as she nodded. "We would be honored," she whispered. Samuel rose and carefully took Daniel into his arms. "This home is his and yours," he declared softly, cradling the sleeping infant. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth as wind rustled through the cottonwoods outside. Hazel closed her eyes in prayer, knowing her late husband's spirit could rest easy now. Samuel's face reflected peace he hadn't known since losing his wife years ago. Through the darkness, the ranch's windows glowed like beacons of hope, sheltering a family bound not by blood but by faith, mercy, and love. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.